Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yu Yan. Welcome to this event that's co-organized by the NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity and the School of Social Sciences. We're very privileged today to have with us Professors Jean and John Comaroff. I'm sure many of you have already read their work, and so I won't read the very long list of things that they've done and they've written. Instead, by way of introduction, I will say why I'm tremendously glad that they're here today. To me, Jean and John's scholarship over the past decades has set for scholars a model for doing ethnography and also for the hard work and important labor of theory making. Their work, on the one hand, involves deep empirical investigations of specificities in everyday practices, while on the other hand, always locates and connects these specificities to grand problems of world historical scale. Then, defying the number of hands we ordinarily refer to, they have on a third hand also continuously interrogated the knowledge production enterprise itself, working through what we can and cannot know from ethnography, imagining how we can extend its possibilities, and considering how our efforts are not merely as individual scholars, but also tied to the shifts in theoretical sensibilities within disciplines. That they can do these three things concurrently and in a sustained way over many years and disparate projects is extraordinary. And then there is the fourth thing, and that is their modeling as well as explicit insistence on the importance and significance of the so-called Global South. This site, or these sites, they insist on seeing and naming not merely as additional cases, but as constitutive of and in interaction with global processes. I think for those of us working in or on the so-called Global South, Jean and John Comaroff have set for us the challenge of addressing grand universal themes and being audacious in staking claims on theory making. They have cracked open certain doors that we can rush if we can find the courage to do so. Finally, theory making. In the troubled world in which we live, Jean and John Comaroff's work continuously reminds us of the transformative potentials embedded in theory making. And this insistence of theirs that theory matters, that theory is a need, because theory involves not just explanations, but imaginations of alternatives. I think they've insisted on this through times when this insistence has become more and not less difficult. I'm especially pleased and excited to hear what they have to say about what happens after labor and how we might theorize this in order to imagine our way into different, dare I say better, futures. So with this, I present to you Professors Jean and John Comaroff.
Thank you, Yuyan, where are you, for that really beautiful introduction. That was very perceptive. Thank you so much. And we're delighted to be here. Thank you to Lavi and Ian for arranging this and for making it all possible. And to all of you for coming. All across the globe, it seems, there is a rising anxiety that wage work, as we have long known it, is fast disappearing. Yet there's little agreement about why, where, or in what measure, or what might take its place in the future. We, as scholars, politicians, pundits, people at large, seem unable to think beyond a universe founded on mass employment. But why not? After all, capital has always tried to free itself as far as possible from a dependency on labor, often with notable success. Indeed, it's now widely recognized that more people have always been wageless than waged. But if employment has always been threatened by erasure, almost more aspiration than actuality, why does it remain so central both to popular and theoretical understandings of economy and society, left and right? How might this relate to fears of its impending end? And more generally, what exactly is unique about this moment in the long history of labor? Can you just pass me a tissue there, Johnny? So I have an allergy to something. Just pass me my bag, that's fine. Thank you. Oh, every service. Thank you so much. The perfect hostess. Thank you so much. That comes later. As we fail to imagine an age after work, we appear to be ever more haunted by the nightmare of our own redundancy, by surreal images of a world in which value is produced by other means, not just by finance or AI or casualized part-timers, but by workers who are at once human and non-human, living and dead, present and absent. Put another way, what finally does all this tell us about the afterlife of Homo Faber, of the living worker? Answers to these questions we submit are greatly enriched, and here I come to Ian's point, by extending our gaze beyond the vantage of Euro-America. The hemispheric north may be the traditional source and horizon of so much of our theory, but a comprehensive grasp of the history of labor and its futures, and of global capitalism at large, has of needs to embrace the entailment of the Euro-American world in its Antipodean, its southern outsides, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, the source, after all, of much of its animating energy and of its most precarious, devalued, and dehumanized forms of labor. It is a history whose southern past the North now seems to be reliving, albeit perhaps unwittingly. In the late 1990s, zombies began to appear in the South African popular discourse. Although foreshadowed in local cultural imaginings, their arrival was both sudden and unexpected, yet its timing was not serendipitous. It occurred as the already fragile infrastructure of black South African life was threatened quite abruptly by a radical shrinking of the labor market. There was a cruel irony here. Wage labor was being made superfluous just when decolonization was supposed to put an end to racial capitalism, to apartheid, promising decent, secure, paid work for all. But the transition to democracy coincided with a worldwide wave of neoliberal reform, reversing the advance after World War II of state-managed social welfare, economic regulation, and redistribution. In the upshot, post-authoritarian societies like South Africa experienced liberation as an anguished mix of enfranchisement and dispossession, of rights-based recognition and jobless growth, the latter a politely evasive term for mass unemployment. It was then that rumors spread about an invading army of surrogate workers. On the one hand, migrants from the north, said to be diseased, desperate, and crime-prone, who were ready to toil at cutthroat rates. On the other, a host of beings, raised by occult means from the dead, who served in a surging, secretive, nocturnal economy. Together, these interlopers were blamed for the loss of jobs. And so it was that wage work, at once desired and disappeared, present and absent, returned in a kind of spectral guise. Zombies, figures who lack the animating qualities of personhood, bodied forth in popular rhetoric, in rumor, in media reportage, in legal disputes, even industrial conflicts. Because they lack human needs, these living dead are pure surplus labor, we can put it this way. They exist, as we were told at the time, by eating away at the lives and livelihoods of others. To be sure, they have been a ghostly presence, what Walter Benjamin called a profane illumination, throughout the history of modernity, reappearing at moments of rupture in prevailing relations of production. As figurations of slavery and colonial extraction, they entered the US vernacular during the occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1943, to be repurposed by the culture industry as the scientifically reanimated undead, as versatile incarnations of late modern monstrosity, predation, and horror. Hence, in our own times of crisis, the circulating images of zombie banks, zombie corporations, voodoo economics. Tellingly, South Africa's bankrupt electricity company, Eskom, said to be the world's largest power utility, has been dubbed the zombie apocalypse. No wonder then that activists staging a public protest last month in Cape Town for the poor and their rights came dressed as zombies. And if anybody wants to see the press coverage for this, it's quite amazing. I'll show you afterwards. As a product of preternatural accumulation, zombies bear uncanny resemblance to recent fictional figures of proletarian annihilation. Like the equisapiens, half horse, half black man, of Boots Riley's searing movie, Sorry to Bother You. I don't know if this has been around in Singapore. The image recalls a point made about racial capitalism by Hilton White, the anthropologist, who cites Morsh Postone's famous analysis of the iconography of anti-Semitism. If Jews, as Postone claims, have historically epitomized the racial body of money without labor, then blacks have been stereotyped as labor without will. Labor in itself, a kind of brute biological force in need of mastery. Boots Riley's horse people are precisely that, horsepower, in genetically engineered form, half man, half beast, fully exploitable. In the movie, they are the invention of a company called Worry Free, a fictive corporation that produces workers who are more effective and cheaper than robots. Now, robots, of course, are the other nightmare of living labor. A new study entitled "You Fired," says the robot, reports an epidemic in the American workplace of technophobia, an anxiety-related syndrome centered obsessionally on robots and artificial intelligence. Nor only in America. An anguished op-ed in 2018 by the head of the University of Johannesburg featured a picture of the first humanoid robot in South Africa. White in color, a national flag painted on its chest, it stared calmly into the fearful eyes of its black creator. Like the zombie, the android, a body eviscerated of life, makes real the fantasy of production without human toil. Even in the face of the putative end of wage employment, we seem to remain trapped in its fetishistic logic. The android and the zombie alike appear as doppelgangers, as ghosts of living labor returned, if only to be effaced, a kind of estranged recognition of the unthinkable. Recall here the underworld workers, zombie killers in red hard hats and overalls, that invade the urban landscapes of Jordan Peele's movie Us, US. I think that has been here. And these figures make the point, in surreal form, that it is the commodity economy itself, however apparently benign, that yields the redundancy of workers. Both zombies and androids will appear in our story as it unfolds. Speaking of that economy, however, and the role of labor in it, a prior point is to be stressed. It is little more than a cliche to note that the social world under capitalism, as a historical formation, has been constituted primarily by wage work. At the same time, several theorists have argued it is a formation with a contradiction at its core. On the one hand, as I've already intimated, its development over time, most recently in global times and places. Sorry. Where is page 5? And with financialization in the digital revolution, has rendered wage labor increasingly anachronistic, increasingly irrelevant to the generation of wealth. To wit, the stock market typically rises when workers are laid off. And yet, on the other hand, that form of labor remains ontologically indispensable to capitalism, essential to its self-understanding, its internal endogenous sense of how value is created. Which perhaps is why, as wage work is devalued and displaced, it tends to return these days, in both theory and in life, in a kind of refigured, dehumanized form. Hence the zombie, the robot, the mutant, each a spectre of human toil under erasure. Toil that retains the traces of its original significance, yet, as Derrida would put it, is rubbed out. These traces are rubbed out. This paradox, that labor is integral to social being, yet is undone by the historical conditions under which it is evolved, is, we suggest, critical for making sense of contemporary debates about the presence and future of labor. Now, modern conceptions of labor, not coincidentally, connive at this counterpoint of indispensability and irrelevance. These conceptions draw on the historical and theological roots of liberal thought, in which work is the defining attribute of species being, of human being, of the capacity to transcend nature, to acquire property, to make history, to reach for the gods. Foucault, recalled, spoke explicitly of its sacred powers, its universal necessity to capitalist modernity. Romantics early and late have insisted that labor transcends its instrumental function. It is artful, ethical, creative, redemptive. Liberal and Marxist thinkers too, even while seeing it at root as productive, remunerative activity, turn to invest it with dignifying, emancipatory potential. But this is in spite of the fact that wage employment has always been, for the most part, coerced, a consequence of dispossession, albeit of different kinds and in different times and places. In spite, too, of the fact that it has long been entailed in a system bent on accruing profit by variously dehumanizing, more or less, by more or less exploitative means, the nature of labor, which by extension makes unalienated toil a kind of unrealizable ideal. Relevant in this regard as well is the feminist objection that received conceptions of work have remained irredeemably narrow and masculinist, perennially romanticizing unpaid domestic activity while ignoring its essential contribution to the generation of wealth and the accretion of social value. Likewise, the observation of critical scholars of racial capitalism to the effect that the articulation, structurally, of gender with race has served further to cheapen both female and racialized labor, thereby producing a kind of double subsidy to commodity production. So the implications are clear. Capital throughout its history has fused multiple different modes of extraction, relying, as Rosa Luxemburg insisted long ago, on various and variously violent practices of accumulation, primitive accumulation, alongside free labor. Hence, for example, the coining of hybrids like semi-proletariat to describe colonial class formations, to whose traces we shall return. Hence also the ideological work entailed in defining, classifying, and ascribing relative value, or no value at all, to various kinds of human activity. Ascriptions that mobilize axes like race, gender, age, and types of work like skilled, unskilled, domestic, or productive, to recognize, prioritize, and relatively remunerate activity, and sometimes, of course, not to remunerate it at all. Self-evidently, then, the commodity economy has always been more diverse, more synthetic in its labor regimes than ruling narratives are wont to suggest. The general point that this historical formation is reenacted repeatedly, if in different mutations, this contradiction at its core, asserting the centrality of free labor and the forms of accumulation associated with it, while simultaneously undermining that very form. The proliferation of occupations, skills, and kinds of compensation implicated in the restructuring of production since the 1970s plays out much the same contradiction in a different key. The varying routines, flexible contracts, and deregulated modes of accumulation that have emerged in these decades, their uncertainties, their precarities, their ruptured temporalities, may seem unprecedented. In the age of rampant financialization and rising self-employment, they may even appear to have a kind of emancipatory possibility. Hence the celebration by post-workers of life beyond formal employment, or the daily grind of what David Graeber has called bullshit jobs. Also by those like Hart and Negri or Ulrich Beck, who claim that more fluid, intelligent forms of labor might eventuate in a new commons, a new civility, a new grammar of the multitude. But much of what looked to be new sorts of occupation actually go back a very long way, unremarked and unremunerated, only to return in renamed and rebranded guise. The flexibility and casualization associated with what has come to be called neoliberalism merely put a techno-economist gloss on forms of job insecurity, piecework and underemployment, and the scanting of labor protection that has been integral to the age of industry. Emergent categories like affective or immaterial work may acknowledge feminist demands for recognition of the unwaged labor of domestic reproduction. But they also tend to sentimentalize that labor, as we've noted, replaying the rhetoric that historically has underwritten the confinement of women's activities, the handmaid's toil, to the priceless space of the home. Even when recognized now as bona fide jobs, affective toil, caring, cleaning, waste management, remain remains the underpaid housework of the public domain. How then is the contradiction at the core of the relationship between capital and labor resolved in these our troubled times? Why do received forms of work, rendered anachronistic, redundant, and surplus to requirements, still retain their elemental significance? And why do they keep returning, often in metamorphized, sometimes spectral guise? How, more broadly, are we to think about an anthropology of labor in our times? A historical parenthesis at this point, courtesy of Thomas Piketty, who reminds us that patterns of inequality have fluctuated visibly over the past century, this in connection with other economic indices and the fortunes of labor. After a period of low and slow growth, accompanied by deepening inequality during the late 19th and early 20th century, there came a phase post-World War II, during which growth and per capita GDP more than doubled and wages rose significantly. Levels of inequality also dropped sharply, only to be followed in the early 1970s and from then on by a dramatic reversal. Since 1973 and into the continuing present, growth and GDP have waned, living standards have fallen for many across the planet, income gaps have widened greatly, and rates of debt have skyrocketed. The optimal middle period from 1945 until the 1970s is associated in the archaeology of capital with state-centric Fordism, underpinned by a Keynesian ideology of economic management, and by sanguine, hopeful imaginings, at least partly realized, of a world of full employment, workers' rights, and comprehensive social welfare, extending to the protection of citizens against questions of joblessness, homelessness, illness, and indigence. A quick look at employment figures in this regard, figures, as we shall see, that hide more than they reveal, is indicative. In the USA, for example, joblessness in the late 1960s was never higher than 3.8%. In the 1980s, in the early years of the Reagan administration, as the Fordist era gave way to the neoliberal, it rose to 10.8. Alike in the UK, whose jobless figures for 1945 to 1971 peaked at 2.7. In 1983, under Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party, it reached 12.9. Significantly, the history of trade unions echoes this trend. In 1954, 35% of all American wage workers were union members. That figure fell to 20% in 1983, soon after the attack on labor by the Reagan administration. It now stands at 11%. British unions at their height in the 1960s and 1970s were also radically undermined during the 1980s at the behest of the Thatcher government and corporate backers. Now, the ironies here are unmistakable. If growth and GDP are taken to be significant markers of material well-being, then both the US and the UK were at their healthiest when jobless rates were at their lowest. Unions were at their strongest. Wages were rising, and inequality was at its most attenuated. Of course, any number of contingencies affect fluctuations in employment and inequality, among them inflationary cycles, recessionary pressures, market corrections, and political upheavals. But our point does not lie in the specificity of these numbers. It lies in the fact that we speak, if tacitly, to a historical consciousness that recalls the post-World War II decades with regard to economies and societies in a very particular kind of way. They hold a particular niche. Those decades, the coming of age of the still powerful baby boomer generation, sustain a paradigmatic presence in the contemporary sociological imagination. This, in many ways, was the moment at which liberal democratic modernity, as retrospectively remembered, reached its optimistic zenith, at which talk of the Great Society in its various global northern variants appeared most persuasive, at which poverty and insecurity seemed to recede in face of the norm of lifelong employment, at which the struggle for civil rights and recognition of difference, most notably in respect of race and gender, looked as if it had made permanent advances, at which the global South looked forward to a more hopeful future. But hiding in plain sight, just off camera, there lurked persisting forms of exclusion, inequity and raw injustice, in immiserated US inner cities, for example, or the bleak housing estates of Northern Ireland, or the poorer reaches of immigrant England, site to novel xenophobic outbreaks at the time, or in the violent theatres of neo-imperial warfare in Southeast Asia, Africa, and in numerous elsewheres. Now, some would see in these places, and in the penumbra of the Cold War, the possibility of popular struggles against prevailing structures of power. There was, of course, a youthful rebellion in the 1960s. There was the rise of black power movements in the West, and the emergence of left-wing regimes in the former colonies. All this at the same time, however, there occurred in counterpoint a resurging of conservative forces that opposed many forms of welfare etatism. In the US, New Deal liberalism. In Europe, labor-driven socialism, casting them as a danger to the freedom of persons and markets, and a harbinger of totalitarianism. From the 1970s onwards, these forces were to capture the political center and push ideological orthodoxy in a contrary direction. For its part, business reacted to the gains made by workers and civil rights movements in Euro-America in the mid-century by devising new free trade mechanisms under a program of global restructuring, orienting towards altering supply chains, production, and the organization of work. And so the long dialectical struggle between capital and labor entered its latest chapter. Wherever it could, the former embodied in ever more sovereign corporate sectors, pushed for privatization, deregulation, casualization, financialization, and reduced legal liability, and policies of austerity at home, and reconfigured flexible outsourced production abroad in places where workers were more abject, less protected, and often forced into wage slavery of one kind or another. Still, for all the reverses that have occurred since, the post-World War conjuncture, 1945 to the 1970s, continues in critical respects to be a received template against which social expectations tend to be measured, even as the deficit between those expectations and lived reality grows every passing year. And so it remains plausible to speak in the kind of future perfect tense of mass employment, of secure salaried work for all, undergirded by the modernist myth honed in the age in which labor seemed to approach the most equitable pact possible with capital, in which also, as we've said, the liberal idyll of redistributive democracy seemed within reach. It is a myth that lingers on, even as for more and more people, its promise seems to recede into the realm of the unreachable, the unreal, and the unrecognizable, even for a rising generation, perhaps the unthinkable, which takes us back to realities present, into a present continuous, now nearly 50 years in the making, a present without a foreseeable denouement. Okay, pass over to the back.
These past decades have seen the convergence of two processes that together shape the latest chapter in the relationship between labor and capital, and specifically of the contradiction at its core. The first of these processes patently lies in the morphing planetary workplace, as the corporate sector has rebuilt global commodity chains and with them its regimes of accumulation. Partly by recommissioning the structures of colonial extraction, partly by capturing post-colonial states, it has recalibrated many of its operations, rendering mobile its sites of manufacture and its lines of distribution. Already in the 1970s, this was anticipated conceptually in what some economists called the new international division of labor, a realignment marked primarily by the migration of proletarian jobs from north to south, primarily in response to falling rates of profit, to rising worker demand for better wages, and to various forms of deregulation. In the world still then known as Third, labor, of course, was much cheaper and much less protected. It was also centered in major measure on the household, on kin and ethnic ties, and on close social networks. Violent extraction at these edges of empire has always been the underside of Euro-modern romance of free labor. Here, everyday economic life necessitated a labile mix of subsistence and petty commodity production, of occasional contract work, of migrant employment, and penny capitalism in what was called the informal sector, and often demanded highly creative forms of credit management. These were and are social ecologies in which rank poverty imposes on individuals and families, especially, of course, on women, an onus for diversified survival strategies, which perforce often include taking the lowest paid, the most insecure, the most menial of jobs. No surprise, then, that it is in the former colonies of the South to which both corporate capital and its rogue competitors, think here blood diamonds, human trafficking, narco-commerce, have turned in the quest to extract optimal returns. Fabrication in these contexts tends to be reduced to its most elemental, to one operation in the supply chain paid minimally for each productive act and for nothing else, and likely to move on abruptly if conditions favor doing so. In the age of the planetary labor market, writes Mark Graham, millions of jobs can now be done from almost anywhere on Earth, even at the level of the micro-task, enabling firms to take advantage of global reserve armies of labor on a per-click rather than a per-person basis. Employees in Central Africa, rural Central Africa, for example, may toil in the most advanced of tech industries, sometimes in open-air factories, carrying out routine, repetitive, piecemeal tasks, like basic data recognition and classification that machines cannot yet perform. But they're told absolutely nothing about the productive process of which they are a dispersed part, nor about the fact that their own work, the very work that they're doing, is soon likely to render them redundant. These flexible geographies of production, adds Graham, exert huge downward pressure on wages and working conditions everywhere at the same time, and they decimate labor markets in the north. Kaushik Basu, just one voice in a fast-growing literature on globalization, work, and inequality, refers to this effect the effect of this planetary articulation as labor linking. The open-air factories of Central Africa and the shuttered industria of the US inner cities are tied integrally to one another, even when the ties that bind them drop out of visibility. What is more, post-colonial work continues to survive mechanization because some, at least African workers, remain cheaper than machines. Even skilled ones may cost less to capital than their robotic replacement, as they do, for example, in African harbors, notes Nina Sylvanus, where, unlike, say, in Hamburg, crane operators have not been substituted by non-human solutions. Workers are called solutions, at least not yet. Nonetheless, the formal employment market, even in its most abject sectors, has shrunk in both North and South. Now, here is where the second process comes into play dialectically. With the attenuation and the casualization of so much of the labor force in the North, there's arisen a lively facsimile of the informal sectors of the South. All the more so with the fall in real wages and the capture of rising numbers of people, both workers and post-workers alike. Post-workers have become a major category in a life world of spiraling and inescapable debt. Indeed, some social theory says now, forget labor capital, think debtor-creditor. It is the real nexus of socio-material life. This creeping informalization is being subsumed partly by the growing gig economy, partly by other economies that are proliferating in inverse relationship to formal labor. The sharing economy, the caring economy, the artisanal economy, the hospitality economy, the criminal economy, the intimate economy, go on and on, the castle economy. None of them, of course, either conventionally proletarian or regularly waged. All of them depend to a significant extent on commodifying the means of ordinary life. Means once viewed in mainstream Euro-America as beyond the market, but now treated as micro-capital to be put to the purposes of accumulation. Focused on the household, and more broadly on the private sphere, in formalization, as in the South, ruptures receive lines between production and reproduction, male and female, work and leisure. And so the infrastructure and the accoutrement of the domestic domain, bedrooms, cars, computers, phones, kitchens, dining room tables, are turned into speculative assets, yielding income from their commercial deployment. Thus does everything and everybody become, in prospect or in practice, capital. Everybody and everything, the object of potential financialization, including, most of all, as Michel Foucault reminds us, the neoliberal person. Of course, informal enterprise has always existed, more or less overtly in northern contexts, especially among the poor. What has changed, and this is significant, what has changed is their proportionate relationship in labor demographics to formal employment, alike blue and white collar, male and female. Also, their recognition as a vital part of material, of social, of psychic, and of ethical life. And of course, their reappropriation through platform business and algorithmic capital back into the formal sector that spun them off in the first place, with, as it turns out, real socio-economic consequences. This last, platforming, of which there's also, of course, now a burgeoning literature, covers a wide spectrum, much of it involving the financialization of informal activities, activities with long histories in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. At one end, of course, we all know are the giants like Uber and Airbnb, which upscale and techno-rationalize ride and room sharing of forms that, in fact, have been around among colonial urban populations for a very long time and live on today. On a more modest scale, for example, and there are many examples on a more modest scale, is Japan's lively rent-a-family industry, epitomized by Family Romance, a company that builds on traditional caring arrangements with analogues across the global South, and that makes human affection and the comforts of home by supplying kinship to clients. Its business model has, in fact, emerging parallels in the North, among them rentafriend.com in North America, whose services include parents for hire. Similarly, the explosion of so-called peer-to-peer, P2P lending, brokered by online firms with their precursors in rotating credit groups across Africa and, of course, in Islamic finance. Or Feastly, with its own Singaporean version, by the way, that offers meals served in a cook's home, recalling African shebeens, past and present, where migrant laborers socialized in the living rooms of a female host, who fuses the roles of mother, wife, and entrepreneur. And so on and on and on. There are literally hundreds of thousands of examples. In point of fact, platforming does more than merely reappropriate micro-entrepreneurial labor. While it may stimulate enterprise, and there's a lot of debate about that, it also makes independent contracting very difficult and charges producers a rising percentage of their income. Self-evidently, too, platforming renders murky, even erases the lines, legal, conceptual, moral, material, between the formal and the informal, also between worker and independent contractor, about which there is a very bitter battle in the courts of California as we speak. To the degree, then, that informalization and its platforming are rapidly gaining ground in the North, where the sharing economy, of course, is given a positive cost-benefit gloss for harnessing the excess capacity of personal assets that would otherwise be idle. Euro-America is coming ever more to resemble the South, living its history, to cite Svetlana Alexeyevich, in second-hand time. This, however, leaves a critical question unanswered. The contradiction underlying the relationship between labor and capital, played out recursively over the centuries, may be manifesting itself structurally, first of all, in a reorganization of the global workforce, its demography, its geography, its temporality, its materiality, and second of all, in a rearticulation of the lines between the formal and the informal. But how precisely is that contradiction making itself felt, both in the experiential and in the political fabric of the everyday present continuous? Almost everywhere, to return to our Ur narrative, public discourse, primed by the mythos of those post-World War II years of which Jean spoke, speaks as though a waged population remains the norm. Labour, as the prime basis of social value, of human dignity, and of material existence, has lost little of its fetishized hold. Ironically, while the age of work seems to have come to an end, observe Cederstrom and Fleming in an extraordinary book called Dead Man Working. It's a darkly provocative reflection on the zeitgeist of our age. Working, they say, has assumed a total presence. Everyone is obsessed with it. Growing angst about it, about its precarity, has heightened its psychic centrality. A compulsive preoccupation with employment drives mainstream political manifestos, drives visions of education, drives criteria of self-worth. Even the finance sector, where value is accumulated precisely by means of ever greater abstraction, distancing itself from commodity production, speaks back the language of labour, speaks back to us with that. It refers to what it traffics in products. As though they were objects, as though they were things that were made. It speaks to its profits as earnings, and it refers to itself as the finance industry. This is hardly surprising. Work is the primary means by which persons are integrated into economy, into society, into polity, into family, notes Cathy Weeks. It is a basic obligation of citizenship, and ethically, if not legally, something seen to be akin to a right. Statesmen everywhere speak in the promissory language of bringing back jobs. Donald Trump's notorious fixation on reviving the largely defunct US coal industries is symptomatic of the nagging impasse between the idealization of blue-collar work and its cynical decommissioning under the pressure of profitability. For their part, voting publics tend to buy into it, tend to buy into those promises, to be sure, whatever form it may assume, however it may metamorphose, the status of wage labour as the basis of species being endures with almost uncanny, sacral persistence. In the USA, remarks Derek Thompson, and I quote him, "Industriousness has served as America's unofficial religion since its founding. The sanctity of work lies at the heart of its country's politics, economics, and social interactions." Similarly in Britain, says Joanna Biggs, where labour gives life meaning, quotes, "when religion, party politics, and community fall away." Nor only in those places. Decent jobs for the citizenry is typically portrayed as a critical function of the state everywhere, hence the millennial promise in government manifestos of returning people to work, even when it is patently impossible to do so. On the other side of this experiential contradiction is the popular perception that the end of work is at hand, never to be reversed. Already in the 1995, economist Jeremy Rifkin argued that worldwide unemployment would increase dramatically as information technology eliminated millions of jobs. His book, which is called The End of Work, evoked some scholarly critique for its technological determinism and for a somewhat reductionist conception of labour. It was a legitimate critique at the time. But like Richard Sennett's account of changes in work and career at the hands of what he called corporate re-engineering and Ulrich Beck's bleak demise of work society, it resonated with a dawning American nightmare. That nightmare underscored by a 2017 McKinsey Global Report, which predicted the loss, listen to this, of 800 million jobs alone by the year 2030. In other words, by 11 years' time, 800 million jobs worldwide are going to be lost. Now, this has echoes in other countries as well, fueled by a rush of recent books, of TV documentaries aimed at mass audiences, most of them pretty apocalyptic in tone, is epitomized by a spreading rust belt, where the flight of industry and the technicization of what remains have left behind basically cityscapes dotted with cadavers, with boarded up stores, with derelict churches and homes, with ghostly school buildings. Not, of course, that capital fails to find new possibilities in the detritus, as Matthew Soules has pointed out, it has turned decay into what he calls zombie urbanism, leveraging ruins through financialization into revenant assets. Here too, it follows some below-radar business practices in the South, where informal entrepreneurs wrestle ravaged real estate into vibrant mercantile centers, as do, for example, the cross-border traders who bring to life decommissioned buildings, devalued spaces, deserted sidewalks in downtown Johannesburg, South Africa, making them into bustling hubs, they will be seen to be believed, for low-end global commerce. Their takings amount to billions of dollars, all in cash. They exceed those of the largest shopping malls in Africa, some of which are enormous, of course. As we would expect, the planetary geography of labor is more complicated than the end of work thesis suggests. Some economists speak about the Luddite fallacy, insisting, not without debate, that new technologies tend to realign existing labor arrangements, often to positive effects, rather than merely destroying them. Many, of course, do still toil in manufacture and service, both in the North and in the South, and not all of them precariously. What is more, with ongoing shifts in the ecology of production, new jobs are created. There's no doubt about that. The low official unemployment figures for most Euro-American nation states, and I'll deconstruct them in a moment, make that plain, even if they do not speak to the nature of those jobs or the fact that many of them fall way below, short, that is, of yielding a livable income. Yet this hardly accounts for or vitiates the existential dislocation and the capricious trade-off of lives, of careers, of futures occasioned by the radical reorganization of work. Witness the felt effects across the world of casualization, of outsourcing, of mechanization, of the polarization of employment markets within and between nations, of the reduced quality of so many wage jobs. Hence, Cederstrom and Fleming's Dead Man Working. It evokes precisely the fear-inducing zombification with which we began, the fear that intelligent machines are changing the name of the game forever. This exacerbated by the fact that they have already invaded some of the most creative, some of the most intuitive professions, from medical diagnosis through criminal detection to musical composition. The question is it academics next? Some scholars point to the fate of horses, once seen as second only to Homo sapiens in their indispensability to economic production and development. There were arguments that one could not see economy without the presence of the horse. No species, however, seems immune from the quest at the ideological core of capital to free itself from the millstone of labor. Remember here those equisapiens, Boots Riley's nightmare, posthumans, half post-horse, past post-human, designed to be cheaper and more efficient than even robots. Nevertheless, the compulsion behind the relentless effort to replace human workers with surrogates is not reducible only to actuarial reason, not only to cost-benefit alone. John Seabrook's account, it's a paradigmatic account of the avid, expensive, yet fruitless push to develop a smart device to pick strawberries in the US, reveals the very complex socio-political forces that intersect in what otherwise might seem to be a mechanical inevitability. The urgency to perfect a robot picker, Seabrook explains, is the effect of the shortage not simply of labor, but of the right kind of labor. In the world over, it is migrants, the abject, the discounted, the displaced, those actually accused of stealing the jobs of nationals who do most menial agricultural work, often under conditions of virtual enslavement, work so degraded that citizens, even jobless ones, will not do them. But contrary to populist misconceptions, advanced industrial states, driven by other obsessions, of course, have in recent years been ever more successful in curbing the entry of foreign workers, of foreign migrants, which has fueled the felt need for a technical solution to a self-inflicted socio-political problem. Meanwhile, vast capital investment despite vast capital investment, it's proving almost impossible to make machine hands replicate the speed, the stamina, the discernment of so-called low-skill jobbers, who of course are not low-skilled at all. Yet, rather than address poor wages or abusive treatment in the industry, its leaders prefer to eliminate pickers altogether, albeit at a mounting cost. Now, this has its own measure of irony. Suggested a union leader in the agribusiness, the agri-workers themselves have long been treated as robots, subjected to ever-increasing demand for output with the decreasing demand for their human needs. But this simply underscores our question. How, at this historical moment, is the contradiction pitting the ideological normative centrality of work against the perception of its imminent end? How is it reconciled in official discourse, in public perception, and in everyday practice? How do we deal with this massive contradiction? Now, the answer lies in several things, of which, due to lack of time, we offer just a brief glimpse here. The first of them is to be found not in its reconciliation at all, but rather in its empirical erasure at the behest of formal economics and state speak, specifically in their occulting of reality by recourse to statistical reason. Put it this way, if in a population a significant percentage of those who lack jobs are made to disappear, discounted, literally discounted, the remaining population, those with jobs, will appear much larger. Basic sense. Under these conditions, there would be no army of unemployed to worry about, nor would the end of work seem imminent. Per contra, full employment would look to lie well besides this side of the horizon of possibility, indeed, of public policy as well. We can keep talking about and jobs for all, thus to sustain the dignity of labor, the wage, as the mythic basis, and I emphasize the mythic basis of the good life. In the USA, for example, the official jobless rate hovers somewhere below 4%, conjuring the illusion, like between 1945 and 1970, of an almost fully employed population. But that figure only takes account of those who are positioned to look for work and actually continue to do so and haven't been extruded from the labor market entirely. It ignores entirely another figure, which is the employment population ratio. That one embraces everyone of working age. That ratio in the US stands at 60.3%. In other words, almost 40% of adult Americans, their sociological profiles, highly predictable, are not in wage work. 40%, right? Likewise, the UK, where unemployment is very much higher than the official count, and where many people are radically underemployed or have given up trying to find work. Note in this respect that workers on flexi-time, part-time, or so-called zero-hour contracts make up 39% of the entire EU workforce. 39% of the entire EU workforce is not in what we would call full-wage employment. Note also that employment rates in Euro-America count all of these people as though they were fully employed. They include anyone who does paid labor for 1 hour or more per week. If you do 1 hour or more per week, you are counted as employed. A fact, of course, that grossly inflates positive jobless statistics. And this is not to mention that wages have fallen further in the past decade than ever in recorded history, registering again the significant gap between a job and a livelihood. If Investopedia is correct, an average wage earner in London needs 1.6 jobs to survive at the poverty level. In New York, it's actually higher. Striking teachers in Kansas turned out to need 3 jobs to make ends meet. The self-employed who serve the myth of rosy employment figures actually earn even less than those in paid jobs. But the point is that this is another case of hiding the predicament of contemporary labor. It's structural demography in occult numeration that makes phenomena appear at the moment that they disappear, at once absent and present. Now, much the same story could be told for many other European nation states. The real counts from the global north, whatever they actually are, and we don't really know, seem to be edging southward. Another closely related way of disappearing the paradox is to redefine labour so broadly as to embrace any form of socially productive activity, be it waged or unwaged, formal or informal, legal or illegal. Now, this is precisely what the 2018 European Commission on the Future of Work does. In recognising unpaid exertions as deserving the dignity classically associated with wage labour. Quote them, traditional concepts of work, and here they echo feminist critiques of the 1970s, must take in a much broader array of non-standard employment, including unpaid contributions to our societies. Thus is the burgeoning informal economy, caring, sharing, the artisanal, the cultural, the criminal, assimilated to the new normal of the North, as it has so long been in the South. Thus, too, is the paradox annulled conceptually by including more or less anything in the category of labour-producing, value-producing activity, and asserting thereby the sustained ethico-theological centrality of work at the core of human being. For the disemployed and those who are pushed into the informal sector, what afflicts them is taken to be the sheer misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In Youngstown or Flint or the the coal towns of Kentucky, in the silent shipyards of Glasgow or the factory-shuttered cities of northern England, or other sites from which jobs have migrated or been replaced by machines. In some, while it may be reconciled or rendered invisible by resort to the faux empirical and the misconceptual, the contradiction has not gone away, neither structurally nor phenomenologically speaking. The present is less a moment of its transcendence than one of wrestling with its constant return. Wage labour remains at the ontological core of capitalism and its culture, of species being under its political theology, of its conception of time and of value, of its unstable ratio of creation and destruction, even as wage work is said to be terminally endangered at its historical end, giving way to ever more abstract financial forms of wealth accumulation, or as we have offered instead, as it recedes, as it changes character, as it takes refuge in other economies, formal or informal, or in the murky spaces in between. Hence the mass anxiety that keeps reappearing in schizoid figurations of labour living and dead, of present and absent, of human and post-human. In the zombie, a spectre lacking species being, in robots made to look like people and people made to act like robots, in mutant multi-species workers of various kinds. Hence, too, the more pragmatic modes of addressing that anxiety, such things as a perennial populist call for more job creation, whatever its impossibility, the increasing, if contested, campaign for basic income grants as a right of citizenship, and most of all, the pursuit of a politics that might conceive of capitalism after labour, or, better yet, reaching beyond it toward a world productive of new forms of life and of livelihood, of labour after capitalism. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 30 minutes for questions. Ian.
Fascinating, Jean and John. Thank you for such an expansive talk. Here in Singapore, we hear a lot about the fourth industrial revolution. And of course, we didn't know we had 3 industrial revolutions till the fourth one came. But in any case, I know that your work previously talked about the first industrial revolution in Britain and how that had tremendous impacts on labour migration, but that also entailed a theological transformation, that it drove missionization in South Africa, right?
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, to what extent have you come across or have you been thinking about the theological implications of these kinds of labour transformations? Is there a rise of messianism? Is there a rise of new cults of an imagined future utopia? McKinsey have a pretty pessimistic prognosis, but I'm wondering if people are reacting and constructing, meaningful imaginary futures in a more optimistic way.
You're not praying to McKinsey.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question, Hugh, because in many respects, I mean, it goes together also with the whole issue, thank you, of what we regard as the theological, and where one draws the line. I mean, in my view, economics is our contemporary theology, right? And I think people like Carl Schmitt and Balibar are correct in saying that the distinction between the formal and the informal when it comes to the sacred is something that we have to rethink very, very basically. But just to think in terms of more formal, modernist distinctions, one of the things that's accompanied all of this, of course, is a certain kind of reconfiguration of the nation-state, the line between state and society, and the degree to which the kind of deregulation and the withdrawal of states from forms of redistribution is part of the story. Now, this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and one of the things that I think has been proven incontrovertibly in the time that we live is that the idea that we were moving towards secularization is totally ridiculous. If anything, there has been a re-enchantment, or at least a revitalization of the role of religious institutions as well as ideologies in the world in which we live. For instance, in much of Africa, as the state has withdrawn, what has expanded to fill that space are ever more comprehensive totalizing forms of institutions under the sign of one or another religion. So that they're not just about churches on Sunday. There's a sense in which the line between the sacred and the profane has been erased. And much of the forms of education, banking, healthcare, and indeed things like economic lending, welfare, that occur in many parts of the South, occur in the context of what are religious institutions. And along with this, go various forms of explanation that also account for this, and whole idioms. I mean, recently I was with a group of students in downtown Cape Town, where a very large Pentecostal church that went from the US South to Brazil to South Africa now operates at the center of the city of Cape Town, right? And it operates every day of the week. And it has outside a ball, all welcome. It's what they call fee-for-service religion. Anybody can come. Monday, it's Sunday. There's sort of conventional prayers. Monday, there's business advice. Tuesday, there's AIDS ministry. Wednesday, there's depression and cancer. So it's a full menu of services. And we were sitting there in the church, and this preacher got up and he said, "I know times are hard, but there's no recession in the kingdom of the Lord. Invest in Jesus, because he pays rich dividends." And before we are too quick to knock those institutions, we have to think about what they do in an extremely complicated way. I mean, I'm very struck by the role of religious institutions in the public life of Singapore and the complexity of their role in bespeaking all kinds of things beyond the narrow definition of the religious. So I think it's a very important set of issues, and the religious, of course, there's a variety of religious organizations, from old-style civil rights critique of the situation in which we exist to prosperity gospels that will promise that if you have enough faith, all will be well. But the point is that there is there's a taking over of the institutional and the theoretical ground of forms of religious thinking. And as if Weber made it clear, the Protestant ethic and the principle of capitalism have always coexisted. And in a neoliberal moment, we see new forms of religiosity that kind of speak to the new kinds of, to finance capital, to forms of informal economy. And there's extraordinary creativity there. I think one of the things we're saying is that we really have to understand the informal as central to not only the way economies work, but to the way in which ideologies and politics and state management and so on have to be rethought. And these churches are there to make that, they make that connection in a really interesting way. So I think it's a really fascinating question. If you want to add.
Yeah, there's nothing to add on the religious front, because that's exactly right. Although we've been struck also, by the way, how Orthodox Christianity has also spoken about flexibilizing itself, flexibilizing architectural forms for churches, etc., etc. So this is a lively discourse, as one would imagine. Religious movements are historical movements, and in that sense, their engagement dialectically. And the interesting question is, to what extent is that dialectic motivated on both sides? I.e., it's not merely that economy is changing and religion changes with it, but the two inform each other in very profound kinds of ways. Once one constructs a notion of an engagement even in the presence with Christianity, it affects the way in which one enters into the nature of the market, etc. etc. So this is a very, very complex dialectic, and Weber Mark II, forget the Fourth Industrial Revolution, seems to be very much upon us. On the Fourth Industrial Revolution
Yes,
issue,
interesting.
There's
an
we're
obsession
both
with
extremely
it.
skeptical of
There's
of
an
the concept.
obsession with it in South Africa.
Yeah, across Africa, everyone's talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but it's become a kind of state discourse which says, well, actually, we're not going to bother about job creation, really, because now it can move to private sector. We're not going to do this because now it can move into a kind of literally a sort of post-liberal economic moment. And when you look at the content, what these become are really kind of empty manifestos, because what they suggest is that economic development moves through stagger step formations, and that actually isn't true, right? Yes, there are moments of enormously powerful forms of technological change, but often we miss the minor ones. There's a wonderful essay by Rafe Samuel, for example, who are arguing about what are the big moments in history, and what do we think the big moments in history are. And he takes, for example, things like the Battle of Waterloo, the changing of technologies of arms in Europe in the 19th century. He says all of that absolutely pales into significance about something that ever only gets a footnote in a history book, and that's the change of the Women's Property Act in England in the 1860s. All that other stuff was irrelevant. All the things that looked big and looked like they were creating revolutionary moments actually were irrelevant. What was relevant was a small shift in the nature of women's property rights, which changed the entire nature of labor politics in Europe. So, the notion of industrial revolutions, that there was one in the 19th century that gave us modernity, okay. But what happens from then on is a progression in the logic of history working itself out, whether one can create radical break. Where I think one can talk about revolutionary moments, and it's a metaphorical thing, of course, is in the nature of knowledge and theory. After all, we talk about 1789 to 1848 as the age of revolution, a la Hobsbawm, etc., the age that gave us the contemporary disciplines, the notion of modernist knowledge, etc. And the question is whether, in the period we're in now, isn't the second age of revolution, in which the disciplines are all undergoing crisis because our terms no longer seem to apply as they did, in the way that the world is constituted, the old forms of Kantian geography don't hold anymore. In that sense, the question is, what is the knowledge basis of the present, not what is the technological basis? I think that is where the shift lies. And that's where the challenge to sociology and the social sciences lie, because many of our old concepts don't work anymore.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe I can pick up on the last point you made before you closed your presentation about what the politics are, how to think about the politics.
Yeah, and this is the $60,000 question. I think one's got to think at many levels at once. Because as John was saying, I mean, there still is an ordinary politics of defending labour as it purports to be, taking literally what the state says, producing jobs, and all over, particularly in the South. These zombies that I spoke about, that appeared in the street in Cape Town, were demanding jobs because they have a constitution that dates relatively recently, to the 1994, 1995, and they were promised, a livelihood and jobs, and they're now demanding them. Right? So at least, demanding that the fiction be acknowledged. And I think the sorts of things that are happening in the court in California, which is actually Uber drivers, and the quest is to make them full workers, registered as workers, not self-employed, and therefore responsible for their own health care, their own risk-taking, and so on. So there's a pushback at that kind of level. And one has to remember that there are still places. I mean, in South Africa, the union movement is part of the tripartite governing alliance, right? And the nature of unions changed, albeit because there is a much, much smaller workforce, but there still is an effort to hold the state accountable to the dignity of labour, to a certain idea of a labour contract, to unemployment pay, and so on. And along with that is the fact that, like in Singapore, where you do have a redistributive state, and in places like Cape Town and South Africa and in Brazil before there was a putsch, but even now there it is surviving, there's a reinvention of a certain kind of welfare state that deals with poverty, that deals with unemployment, that deals with the health of women and children and so on. So there's one whole level that still fights that logic, it seems to me, and has to hold that thing accountable. Then there's the question of what we all do to demystify the presumptions about labour and to say, okay, people are surviving, but how? The story we've been telling ourselves is not adequate to describe what's going on. I think, as we've tried to suggest, there's an amazing creativity and vibrance to these informal economies, right? Which is not to say they're going to save the world, but there are ways in which they can be recognized, assisted. People can get certain kinds of formal benefits. They can be, the recipients of the sorts of things that formal workers should get. So theorizing that whole domain is also significant. So that's one whole other domain, is to think about how we, as John was suggesting, reformulate our idea of the economic. I mean, it's really fascinating that if you look, for instance, at the World Bank, that until about 2 years ago was excoriating informal labor, as is done in much of the world, right? In Latin America and Africa, informal employment was what was killing the formal economy. If it wasn't for all these people laboring informally, jobs would appear, and they should, sort of desist from informal activity and take up jobs as if they were there in the formal economy, right? Now suddenly, there's a celebration of what is seen to be, creative job production in these domains where people are working in defunct mines without electricity up and down Africa, because that's the way that they're trying to survive. And there's a recognition slowly that this too is work, and we have to define what we mean by it, and we have to rethink the whole way in which livelihoods are made, and recognize also that in the informal economy, certain things like redistribution, informal credit, the degree to which people put people before profits, because in the long term social relationships mean more than the formal contract. There's a whole alternative in morality and ethics of business that you can show with fieldwork and ethnography is sustainable over generations. These are not just fleeting forms of economy. So those are the sorts of things I think also that need to be, to be looked at. And so there are various ways in which, but also to devise a kind of politics that no longer talks the language or relies upon these formal notions of employment and the structures they presume. We have exquisite laws in South Africa for people in the workplace, but there are communities where 66% of young male black people are out of work. So it's irrelevant to them, the kinds of things that this exquisite constitution have provided. So we need to think again, and forms of mobilization that are happening, forms that link domestic workers with people in the public domain, forms of street activity, forms of rethinking, and then at another level altogether, how do we begin to tax the most abstract forms of economy in the finance sector, in terms of online business, that whole domain of the cyber economy. Even if we had the will to tax in America now, which we don't, of course, with our current regime, although there's a strong push in the other direction, but we've not got anywhere yet in assuming that that's going to establish itself. But even if we had the will, it's very hard to know how you actually formally extend our notions of taxation to forms of the cyber and finance economy that are sometimes instruments so complex that even the operators don't quite know how they work, right? So there's what's called Plan B, the kind of alternative economics in the UK right now, which is an effort to try and say we have to think again about how we deal with recuperating, forms of redistribution from that whole financialization, debt-based economy. And I think to diffuse the idea that we make money through technology alone or that the future lies, no economy can be based simply on financialization and indebtedness. Right? Yeah. And that myth that you can have a world without labor and that finance economy is unconnected to ordinary working people. Yeah. We saw in 2008 the myth that was, and we're heading for another kind of sort of rebalancing that I think will be even more disastrous.
I don't have much. I mean, that's a very comprehensive answer. But I do think one thing that our pedagogy has got to think about that all the time. What was interesting about the rise of liberal theory was it built into itself an idea about the perfectibility of the social. So whether one liked it or not, modernization theory was a telos about affecting a sociology that changed the world. This is true of neocon theory as well. It went to work in the 60s and 70s and came up with an alternative plan of how to make the world work. We continue to teach about what we're against. right? We all know we're against a whole bunch of things. We're great at the politics of negation and of critique, but we're very poor at the politics of creation. And precisely the questions that Jean's been asked. And one of the most vibrant things about teaching in the South, by the way, is that we're confronted with these arguments by our students. They say, okay, time to reunionize. Forget old union organizations. We're going to reunionize in our kind of way. Right? We're going to make arguments for a state that does redistribute into from finance capital into a public sector, but not a public sector that whose main job it is to really redistribute its funds back into the private sector, which of course the modern state, or the contemporary state, does. It's inverted its logic. We thought of the modernist state as an organization that collected private funds and put it to a public good. Now we think of the state as something that takes public funds and distributes in the private sector. Young activists in the South are saying, no, that's not the way it has to be. We have to reconsider a new theory of the state that doesn't redistribute into forms of welfareism, or indeed welfareism conducted by the private sector, but rather into forms of public project, making education free, all of that kind. And the discourse are very, very vibrant. A politics of life that ensures that everybody has a home, etc. And some global southern states, including South Africa, actually have been fairly respondent to it. You know, for all its sins, and it's committed many of them, it has built 3 million homes since 1994. Because, in fact, not because it's wanted to, but because its public constantly insists on it and says, we're simply not going to vote for you. The other thing that's been mobilized in many global southern contexts is ethnic movements. Now, there are all kinds of dangers in the politics of identity when it intersects with national politics. But one thing about them in some parts is that they've been socialized. That is to say, identitarian groups have gotten together and said, okay, we have common cause. And what's our common cause? As Jean said, 60% of our young people are unemployed. We all have that cause. It's not that we want first to be Zulu, or we want first to be Tswana or whatever, but we are in the first place South Africans who, through our endogenous structures, can make a different demand on the state. Why? Because if the Zulu decide not to vote for the government, they fall. Right? That's the majority population. So there are all kinds of ways of making new kinds of coalitions. But we in the academy have got to start taking on those things seriously and not simply letting them slide and not simply comforting ourselves with the politics of the anti.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that's happened in South Africa is the student movement, right? And there's a very interesting history that goes.
Sorry.
Yeah,
It's called displacement.
that went from Eastern Europe to the Arab Spring and back to Southern Africa, and the decolonization, which is another term that's everywhere, and it's beginning here too, right? And what one means by this, it's complicated. It's often a kind of rhetoric of simple reductionism. And what the arguments are useful. But one of the things that has been very, very interesting is to think, what is the university for? Universities are under threat everywhere. And the humanities and the social sciences above all else, right? Yeah, we're moving to a kind of austerity politics that's cutting programming and so on and so forth. And in many parts of like in South Africa, for instance, students simply stood up and said, this is what we need now. We need to be able to theorize what's going on at this point. And they did this.
Casualization of labor.
They did this exactly by looking at and said, who are we in the university? Not just the students. We've got to start with the workers, with the people. Now, we've been trying to do this at Harvard for 30 years. It's not succeeded. But they succeeded because they used a certain kind of might. And it's been a very interesting movement because they actually managed to get free tertiary education, which is something people said is not thinkable in this current world. How sustainable it'll be, I don't know. But the mere fact that it was a performance that made it possible that certain kinds of principles could be acted upon. It was very salutary. So I think, and now it's turning towards curriculum. What is the curriculum we need at this point? And how do we rethink that? So, and this has got alliances through, because this is one of the wonderful things about being in a cyber age. They're working with students in Latin America and so on. So, yeah, it's.
We have time maybe for one last question.
Yeah.
It's more of a comment / question. Thank you so much. So you've talked very much about precarity, of course. The other P that struck out to me was also the platforming of precarity. I guess I would orient my question around another P, which is publicness, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about how we can visualize what you're speaking about in the everyday, right? Because I'm thinking about, when we're talking about the precarious and the underemployed or the repurposed worker, we see them in the public spaces of the city, right?
Yeah,
Whether
absolutely.
these be the Deliveroo or, in the Singaporean equivalent, the Grab drivers who hang out in between deliveries with their personal mobility devices at the void decks of our public housing estates, or this be the migrant workers who spend their weekends
the
in public
Filipino
spaces
maids.
that were not, Filipino maids, South Asian male migrants who spend their time at public spaces that were not necessarily planned for them.
Exactly.
Or whether these be, also new migrants who purchase their groceries at shopping malls that Singaporeans no longer go to, right? There's a publicness there's a public spatiality, I think,
Absolutely.
to what you're talking about, right? So I wonder if you might have a comment on that.
Arthur, yeah. What you say is absolutely crucial, and in fact, a return to the public, away from the privatization of the suburbs, of the house with high walls, with the elevated abstraction of so much of where money is made, and where elites live, is part of the whole story that we're talking about. At the end of apartheid, there was a retreat from the center of the city, right? And people, particularly white elites, right, moved to the suburbs. Business moved to the suburbs. That's what deregulation was about, in a way, right? So you now can be in a neighborhood and you don't know behind the walls whether it's a private family or whether they're dealing with stocks across the world or whatever. But what happened was that the poor took to the city, right? And initially there was a period where the city, nobody went downtown. It was like that in the US, throughout up until the late 80s, right? Where nobody went downtown. You lived in the suburbs and they were dangerous places. And the people that were there were in their own way isolated from the economy. But these things have shifted in all kinds of ways because of the ways in which there's been a repurposing of those kinds of resources. And in many places now, downtown, places downtown, and I'm not talking now about Manhattan or the downtown in Paris, but they're places of where these alternative informal economies are really happening, right? And people insist on the right to the city. In Latin America and various parts of the US, the movement for the right to the city, the right to be visible, the right to be out there, to the right, and the forcing of the media to take note of you, right? So that the ways in which public protest happen, and the whole ways in which people understand the kind of camera-ready necessity for doing politics, so that that's all part of what's happened, and an effort to reverse the fact that for a long time, for instance in Paris, if you were a North African migrant, and you lived out in the bidonville suburbs on the periphery, you had a completely different transport system that took you in and out, and there was no way that it intersected with the clean trains of the high bourgeoisie that went into. There've been ways in which the politics of these populations, and it's not the same everywhere because often migrant laborers don't have the power or the capacity to do this. But there are particularly indigenous populations that are in this category, have forced a certain kind of interconnection. And in the South, I suppose, because cities have never been as pristine as they are, in the North. There is a sense in which there always has been matter out of place, and people insist on being seen. And the one thing that is very important in places like South Africa is that you cannot anymore simply remove vagrants, because that was the way that colonial economies worked. You picked up people who should not be in the public sphere. And unless you had a pass or a job or you looked a certain way, there was a whole way of rendering these places sanitized. And now there's a real assertion that people are going to be there, right? It's a battle, though, because people who own expensive real estate don't want that kind of public, right? But it's a contestation, a very aware kind of contestation.
A couple of things. That last point about vagrancy. I mean, one of the things that smart political movements actually argue for is to get anti-vagrant laws delegalized, because it's the one way that public protest is rendered criminal. One of the things that the right discovered very early on, which, by the way, have theories about how you use publics. I mean, Donald Trump has been superbly clever at using publics, Right? And what is more, and this is the critical thing, rendering a public into a spectacle. Because a public as a public has to be rendered into something beyond itself in order to have political valence. Again, the right has theorized this and the left hasn't done it very well until since the 1960s. It really went into abeyance in the 70s. And there are good historical reasons for that. One of those good historical reasons, of course, is social media, which is the other domain of the creation of publics. So, in effect, if one wants to theorize how one turns publics, as it were, massification into publics and publics into spectacle, combining, as it were, the multidimensionality of space, i.e. virtual space, street space, etc., becomes foundational to do it. The other, of course, is electronic space, TV space, because the capacity to actually move things by virtue of communicating is possible through electronic and not only digital media either. So working on those kinds of things is crucial. But the major political issue behind that is the question of recapturing the democratic public sphere by insisting that it isn't criminalized. And one of the first things that states do in dealing with protest is to say, this is trespass, this is destruction of property, it's no longer political, it belongs to, and of course the most foundational element of power is the capacity to determine where politics ends and criminality begins. Because that, in effect, has the capacity to de-authorize, to depoliticize even the most powerful. So again, the strategies of the street. The other place where a lot of this is occurring, and we haven't talked about it, we talk about it in our other work, is the domain of lawfare. Right? The domain of mobilizing the courts for mass spectacle and mass movements. And that's another whole topic for another day, but it's a foundational one for mounting. Many of the things that Jean spoke about earlier, the movements of homeless people, etc., have all been fought in the courts, because that's one context in which scale can be, as it were, reconfigured. Now, the use of courts doesn't always end up in the right way, but it does more often than we think.
You know, Hannah Arendt said that the first act of politics is to appear, to have the ability to appear. And merely the appearance of a public is a very big thing. Yeah, that is crucial. Yeah? And we can't take it for granted. And I think you know what I mean everywhere, right? And this is a really important thing that you're asking about, because without that, the churches are important too, because there's a semi-public dimension to those. Yeah? So they're qualified, there's no one public. But the sense of simply the right to appear is a key thing that we can't take for granted. And in many places, it still has to be struggled for.
Thank you. I think that's a really good line to end the session on.
It's all appearances.
So please join me in thanking Professors Jean and John Comaroff for a very enlightening and thought-provoking session. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful.